The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows across the weathered parchments scattered on Niccolò Machiavelli's desk in his modest villa outside Florence. It was the winter of 1513, and the former diplomat found himself in enforced retirement, exiled from the political machinations of the Medici court. Yet in this apparent defeat, he would discover principles that would echo through the centuries, not merely about power and statecraft, but about the fundamental nature of wealth creation and preservation. As Machiavelli penned his observations about human nature and the acquisition of power, he unknowingly laid the groundwork for understanding something far more universally applicable: the art of intelligent spending is the foundation of lasting wealth. His insights, born from watching princes rise and fall, merchants prosper and perish, and republics flourish and crumble, would reveal that the path to riches lies not in earning more, but in spending with strategic precision. The morning sun broke through the shutters of his study as Machiavelli reflected on a conversation he had witnessed years earlier between Lorenzo de' Medici and a Venetian merchant. The merchant, despite controlling vast trade networks, lived modestly and invested every ducat with careful consideration. Lorenzo, meanwhile, surrounded himself with opulence that drained his coffers faster than his revenues could replenish them. The merchant's wealth grew exponentially while Lorenzo's diminished, despite the latter's seemingly superior position and resources. This observation would become central to Machiavelli's understanding of wealth, that fortune favors not the highest earners, but those who master the delicate balance between necessary expenditure and strategic restraint. In his letters to friends, he would later write that a prince who cannot control his spending will find his kingdom as vulnerable as a fortress with broken walls. The same principle, he realized, applied to any individual seeking to build lasting prosperity. Part 1: The foundation of strategic spending. The concept of virtue, which Machiavelli would make famous in his political writings, extends far beyond the realm of statecraft into the domain of personal finance. Virtue represents the skillful adaptation to circumstances, the ability to act decisively when fortune presents opportunities, and the wisdom to prepare during times of abundance for inevitable periods of scarcity. In the context of wealth building, virtue manifests as the discipline to spend intelligently rather than impulsively. Machiavelli observed that the wealthy families of Florence shared certain characteristics that transcended their diverse sources of income. The Medici banking empire, the textile fortunes of the Pezzi, and the trade networks of the Portinari all demonstrated a common thread: their spending served multiple purposes simultaneously. Every major expenditure was evaluated not merely for its immediate utility, but for its potential to generate future returns, enhance their reputation, or provide security against unforeseen circumstances. When Cosimo de' Medici commissioned Brunelleschi to design the Medici Palace, critics whispered about the enormous cost. Yet Machiavelli, observing from his position in the chancery, noted the strategic brilliance of the investment. The palace served as a residence, certainly, but it also functioned as a symbol of Medici power that attracted clients and allies, a venue for conducting business that impressed foreign dignitaries, and a repository of artistic treasures that could be liquidated if necessary. This was not spending for mere display, but spending as a tool of wealth multiplication. The principle extends to smaller, more personal decisions that accumulate over time to create vast differences in financial outcomes. Machiavelli noticed that successful merchants in the Oltrarno district shared similar habits in their daily lives. They purchased high-quality tools and materials that lasted longer and performed better, reducing long-term costs while improving productivity. They invested in their health through good food and medical care, preventing costly illnesses that could devastate both their physical well-being and their business operations. They spent on education and books, expanding their knowledge and capabilities in ways that opened new opportunities for profit. These observations led Machiavelli to formulate what he privately called the principle of compound spending, the idea that intelligent expenditures create cascading benefits that multiply over time, while foolish spending compounds in the opposite direction, creating ever greater drains on resources. A merchant who buys cheap tools that break frequently not only pays more in replacement costs but also loses productivity during repairs and suffers the opportunity cost of time that could have been spent on profitable activities. The winter evenings in his villa provided Machiavelli with ample time to reflect on the mathematical nature of wealth accumulation. He calculated that a tradesman earning 100 florins annually who spent 90 wisely would accumulate wealth faster than one earning 150 florins but spending 140 carelessly. The difference lay not in the absolute amounts but in the ratio of productive to unproductive expenditure.
The first tradesman's 10 florins of savings, invested wisely, would begin generating their own returns, while his disciplined spending habits would likely reduce his future costs.
The second tradesman's meager 10 florins of savings would be constantly at risk of being consumed by the poor decisions that characterized his spending patterns. This mathematical reality revealed itself most clearly during times of economic stress. When the French invasion of 1494 disrupted trade throughout Italy, Machiavelli witnessed how different approaches to spending determined survival or ruin. Families who had spent their prosperity on durable goods, productive assets, and strong relationships found ways to weather the storm. Those who had squandered their wealth on temporary pleasures and status symbols were quickly reduced to poverty.
The siege of Florence in 1529, though it occurred after Machiavelli's death, would prove his theories correct in the most dramatic way possible.
Citizens who had followed principles of strategic spending, maintaining food stores, investing in tools and skills that remained valuable during wartime, and building networks of mutual support, not only survived but often emerged from the crisis in stronger positions than before. Meanwhile, those who had lived for immediate gratification found themselves helpless when external circumstances shifted. Machiavelli's correspondence with his friend Francesco Vettori reveals his growing understanding that spending behavior reflects and shapes character in profound ways. The discipline required to consistently make intelligent spending decisions develops the same mental faculties needed for success in business, politics, and personal relationships. The individual who can delay gratification to purchase quality over convenience, who can invest in long-term benefits rather than short-term pleasures, and who can maintain perspective during both prosperity and adversity, possesses the virtue necessary for lasting success in any endeavor.
The social dynamics of Renaissance Florence provided a perfect laboratory for observing these principles in action.
The city's republican institutions meant that political power often correlated with economic success, creating a feedback loop where wise spending enhanced both wealth and influence. Families who invested in public works, patronage of the arts, and support for civic institutions found their political fortunes rising alongside their economic ones. This was not mere correlation but causation. Their spending patterns demonstrated the same strategic thinking that made them valuable allies and effective leaders. As autumn gave way to winter in his exile, Machiavelli began to see that the relationship between spending and wealth creation was not simply about accumulation but about the development of what he would call financial virtue. Just as political virtue enabled a prince to adapt to changing circumstances and seize opportunities, financial virtue allowed individuals to navigate economic uncertainty while positioning themselves for growth. This required not just restraint but strategic boldness, knowing when to spend aggressively to capture opportunities and when to conserve resources for future needs. Part 2, The Psychology of Wealth and the Illusion of Abundance. The human mind, Machiavelli observed, is poorly suited to the realities of wealth building. Sitting in his garden on a warm spring morning, watching the peasants tend to their crops with methodical patience, he reflected on the fundamental disconnect between human psychology and financial success. The same impulses that served humanity well in simpler times, the desire for immediate rewards, the tendency to display status, the preference for certain pleasures over uncertain future benefits, became liabilities in an economy where delayed gratification and strategic thinking determined outcomes. From his window, Machiavelli could see the villa of a neighboring merchant who had recently come into a substantial inheritance. Within months, the man had expanded his household staff, purchased elaborate furnishings, and begun hosting lavish entertainments. To casual observers, these expenditures signaled success and prosperity. But Machiavelli, with his keen eye for human nature and its consequences, recognized the pattern that would likely lead to the merchant's eventual ruin. The psychology of spending, he realized, was intimately connected to the psychology of power. Just as new princes often overestimated their authority and made bold moves that ultimately weakened their position, newly wealthy individuals frequently confused the possession of money with the security that money could provide. They spent as though their current income would continue indefinitely, failing to account for the natural fluctuations of fortune that affect all human endeavors. This psychological trap manifested itself in what Machiavelli privately termed the illusion of abundance. When money flows freely, the human mind adapts to higher levels of expenditure with remarkable speed. Luxuries quickly become necessities, temporary indulgences evolve into permanent expectations, and the mental framework that once considered modest spending adequate expands to accommodate ever greater outlays. The merchant who once felt wealthy spending 50 florins annually soon finds himself feeling constrained at 100 florins, then 200, then 500. The most insidious aspect of this psychological adaptation was its asymmetric nature. While the mind readily adjusted to higher spending levels, it resisted returning to lower ones with fierce determination. Machiavelli observed this phenomenon repeatedly among the diplomatic corps, where ambassadors who had lived grandly on official expenses struggled to maintain appropriate dignity when posted to less prestigious assignments with smaller budgets. Their inability to adapt their spending downward often forced them to supplement their income with personal funds, gradually eroding their family wealth. The solution, Machiavelli concluded, lay not in fighting human nature but in understanding and redirecting it.
The same psychological mechanisms that created the illusion of abundance could be harnessed to support wealth building rather than wealth destruction.
The key was to create mental frameworks that made intelligent spending feel as psychologically rewarding as impulsive spending, while simultaneously making wasteful expenditure feel as uncomfortable as actual deprivation. He developed what he called the doctrine of productive pleasure, the idea that true satisfaction comes not from the immediate gratification of spending but from the long-term security and expanded opportunities that strategic spending creates. This required a fundamental shift in perspective, viewing money not as a means to purchase immediate pleasure but as a tool for purchasing future freedom and capability. The doctrine required practical application to become effective. Machiavelli advised his correspondents to establish what he called spending rituals that made intelligent expenditure feel deliberate and significant. Before making any substantial purchase, they should spend time researching alternatives, calculating long-term costs and benefits, and explicitly considering how the expenditure aligned with their broader goals. This process transformed spending from an impulsive act into a thoughtful ceremony, creating psychological satisfaction from the decision-making process itself rather than just from the acquisition of goods. He also recommended what he termed strategic deprivation, deliberately choosing less expensive alternatives in some areas in order to afford higher quality in areas that mattered more. A craftsman might eat simple meals at home in order to afford the finest tools for his trade, finding satisfaction not in the deprivation itself but in the knowledge that his sacrifice was creating future benefits. This approach required individuals to develop clear hierarchies of value, understanding which expenditures contributed most to their long-term success and happiness. The social pressures of Renaissance Italian society provided constant challenges to these principles. Status display through consumption was not merely a luxury but often a business necessity. Merchants who appeared too modest risked losing clients who doubted their success, while diplomats who failed to maintain appropriate dignity undermined their effectiveness. Machiavelli recognized that completely ignoring these pressures was neither possible nor advisable, but he also understood that many people used social expectations as excuses for financial indiscipline. The solution lay in what he called strategic magnificence, identifying the specific areas where display was truly necessary for professional success and focusing expenditure there while maintaining strict economy in areas where appearance mattered less. A banker might invest heavily in fine clothing and an impressive office while living modestly at home and traveling simply. This approach required careful analysis of which audiences mattered most and what specific signals they valued, avoiding the common mistake of trying to impress everyone in every situation. Machiavelli's observations of the Borgia family provided a perfect case study in the relationship between spending psychology and ultimate success or failure. Cesare Borgia's military campaigns were funded through a combination of papal revenues, territorial conquest, and strategic alliances. When these funds flowed freely, Cesare spent lavishly on military equipment, fortifications, and political bribes. However, his spending patterns revealed a crucial weakness: he had not developed the psychological discipline to adjust his expenditures when circumstances changed. When Pope Alexander VI died and Cesare's political position became precarious, his inability to rapidly reduce his costs contributed to his downfall. He continued to maintain expensive military forces and elaborate courts even as his income plummeted, burning through his reserves at a rate that made recovery impossible. A leader with better financial virtue would have immediately shifted to a more modest operational style, preserving resources while seeking new sources of revenue and support. The contrast with successful merchant families was striking. The Fugger banking dynasty, which Machiavelli had observed during diplomatic missions to Germany, demonstrated remarkable psychological flexibility in their spending patterns. During profitable periods, they expanded their operations and increased their investments in new ventures. During difficult times, they could rapidly contract their expenses while maintaining the core activities that would position them for future growth. This adaptability required not just financial knowledge but psychological discipline that treated changing spending levels as strategic decisions rather than personal failures. As the seasons turned in his Tuscan exile, Machiavelli began to understand that the psychology of spending was ultimately about the psychology of time itself. Intelligent spending required individuals to feel as emotionally connected to their future selves as to their present selves. The merchant who could vividly imagine the security and opportunities that modest spending today would create tomorrow was far more likely to resist immediate temptations than one who lived entirely in the present moment. This temporal perspective explained why some individuals seemed naturally suited to wealth building while others struggled despite high incomes. Those who possessed what Machiavelli called temporal virtue could experience genuine pleasure from actions that benefited their future selves, even when those actions required present sacrifice. They had developed the psychological capacity to feel successful when making decisions that would pay off years later, rather than requiring immediate gratification to feel satisfied with their choices. Part 3, The Compound Effect of Strategic Decisions and Long-Term Wealth Creation. The monastery bells of Sant'Andrea in Percasina chimed vespers as Machiavelli walked through his vineyard, examining the grapevines that would determine his harvest in the coming autumn. Each vine represented years of careful investment, not just the initial cost of planting, but seasons of pruning, fertilizing, and patient cultivation. The parallel to wealth building was unmistakable. Like viticulture, financial success required understanding that today's actions would determine outcomes years or even decades in the future. This agricultural metaphor had crystallized Machiavelli's thinking about what he now recognized as the most powerful force in wealth creation: the compound effect of strategic decisions made consistently over time. Just as compound interest multiplies money through mathematical progression, compound wisdom multiplies the effectiveness of every financial choice through the accumulated benefits of experience, relationships, and reputation built through years of intelligent behavior. The concept had emerged from his careful study of the Venetian trading system during his diplomatic missions. Venice's commercial dominance did not result from any single brilliant strategy or fortunate discovery, but from generations of merchants making consistently intelligent decisions about everything from ship construction to trade route selection to diplomatic relationships. Each wise choice made subsequent choices easier and more profitable, while each merchant's success contributed to Venice's overall reputation for reliability and competence. A Venetian trader who invested in higher quality ships found that his vessels lasted longer, required fewer repairs, and attracted better crews. The superior crews enabled him to carry more valuable cargoes and complete voyages more quickly. The increased profits allowed him to expand his fleet while building relationships with the most reliable suppliers and customers. Over time, these advantages compounded until he possessed not just more ships but better information networks, stronger partnerships, and enhanced credibility that opened opportunities unavailable to competitors who had initially saved money through cheaper alternatives. The same principle operated at every level of economic activity. Machiavelli had observed how Master Giuliano, a carpenter in nearby San Casciano, had transformed his modest workshop into the most prosperous construction business in the region through decades of strategic spending decisions. Early in his career, Giuliano had invested heavily in superior tools when most of his competitors bought adequate ones. The better tools enabled him to work faster and produce higher quality results, attracting customers willing to pay premium prices. Instead of keeping these higher profits for immediate consumption, Giuliano reinvested them in even better tools, training for advanced techniques, and eventually in hiring and training apprentices who shared his commitment to excellence. Each level of investment made the next level possible, while each success enhanced his reputation and attracted more lucrative commissions. By the time Machiavelli knew him, Giuliano commanded fees several times higher than his competitors while maintaining a backlog of customers waiting months for his services. The mathematical nature of this compounding effect fascinated Machiavelli's analytical mind. He calculated that two craftsmen starting with identical skills and resources could achieve dramatically different outcomes within a decade based solely on their spending patterns. The one who invested 20% of his income in tools, training, and business development while living modestly on the remainder would likely earn 3 to 5 times more than the one who spent most of his income on immediate pleasures while making minimal investments in his capabilities. These calculations revealed why the relationship between current income and ultimate wealth was often inverse to common expectations. High earners who spent most of their income achieved temporary lifestyle improvements but little long-term security. Modest earners who consistently invested significant portions of their income in productive assets built wealth that eventually supported lifestyles far superior to those of their higher-earning but less disciplined counterparts. The compound effect extended beyond financial returns to encompass social and intellectual capital. Machiavelli's own career illustrated this principle. His relatively modest family background would normally have limited his access to high-level political positions. However, his strategic investments in education, languages, and diplomatic skills created opportunities that wealth alone could not have purchased. Each successful mission enhanced his reputation and led to more important assignments, eventually positioning him at the center of Florentine politics despite his humble origins. This social compounding was particularly visible among the merchant families of Florence. The Medici had leveraged their banking profits into political influence, which they used to secure advantageous trade agreements and political positions for family members. Each generation built upon the advantages created by previous generations, until the family possessed not just wealth but networks of relationships that could survive temporary financial setbacks and create new opportunities for recovery and growth. The reverse was equally true. Families that squandered their social capital through poor spending choices found their decline accelerating as former allies and customers lost confidence in their judgment. The Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici had failed not just militarily but because the conspirators had gradually eroded their reputation for reliability and wisdom through years of increasingly desperate financial decisions. When the moment came to rally support for their cause, they discovered that their past behavior had undermined the trust necessary for political success. Machiavelli recognized that understanding compound effects required thinking in terms of systems rather than individual transactions. Every spending decision existed within a network of relationships and consequences that extended far beyond its immediate impact. The merchant who underpaid his suppliers might save money in the short term but would likely face higher prices and reduced cooperation in the future. The craftsman who used inferior materials to increase his profit margins would eventually lose customers to competitors offering superior quality. These systemic effects created what Machiavelli called virtuous cycles for those who spent strategically and vicious cycles for those who prioritized short-term savings over long-term value. The virtuous cycles began slowly but accelerated over time as each wise decision made subsequent decisions easier and more profitable. The vicious cycles also began slowly, making them particularly dangerous because their effects were not immediately apparent to those trapped within them. The acceleration of these cycles explained why wealth gaps tended to widen over time rather than remain stable. Individuals caught in vicious cycles found themselves with fewer resources and worse options each year, making it increasingly difficult to break free from destructive patterns. Meanwhile, those in virtuous cycles discovered that their expanding resources and improving circumstances made it easier to maintain and expand their advantageous position. Breaking free from vicious cycles required what Machiavelli termed strategic disruption, deliberately accepting short-term costs in order to access the long-term benefits of virtuous cycles. This might involve taking on debt to invest in education or equipment, accepting lower immediate income to join a more promising enterprise, or sacrificing current lifestyle to build savings that would eventually provide greater security and opportunity. The most successful examples of strategic disruption involved individuals who recognized early warning signs of vicious cycles and took decisive action before their situation became irreversible. A merchant who noticed declining profit margins might invest heavily in new product lines or market expansion, accepting reduced current income to position himself for future growth. A craftsman whose skills were becoming obsolete might spend his savings on learning new techniques, temporarily reducing his standard of living to ensure his long-term employability. As winter approached again in his rural retreat, Machiavelli reflected on how these principles applied to entire societies as well as individuals. Republics that invested in infrastructure, education, and defensive capabilities created compound advantages that enabled them to prosper for centuries. Kingdoms that spent their wealth on luxury and display while neglecting their fundamental strengths eventually fell to better prepared rivals, regardless of their initial advantages. The lesson for individuals was clear: lasting wealth required thinking like a republic rather than like a kingdom. Instead of focusing on impressive displays of current prosperity, intelligent individuals invested in the infrastructure of their own lives, their health, skills, relationships, and productive assets. These investments created compound returns that eventually supported levels of security and capability that pure consumption could never achieve. Machiavelli's final insight concerned the irreversible nature of compound effects once they reached certain thresholds. Just as compound interest eventually reaches a point where the returns themselves generate more income than the original principal, strategic spending eventually creates enough accumulated advantages that maintaining and expanding wealth becomes significantly easier than the initial accumulation phase. This threshold effect explained why established wealthy families could maintain their position even with spending patterns that would destroy someone starting from a modest position. Their accumulated social capital, business relationships, and diversified assets provided multiple sources of security and income that could absorb temporary setbacks while continuing to generate new opportunities. For those still building toward this threshold, understanding its existence provided both motivation and strategic guidance. Every intelligent spending decision brought them closer to the point where their accumulated advantages would begin generating their own momentum. The key was maintaining discipline through the difficult early years when the benefits of strategic choices were not yet fully apparent, trusting in the mathematical certainty that compound effects would eventually transform small advantages into decisive ones. The spring of 1514 brought news that the Medici had returned to power in Florence, and, with them, the possibility that Machiavelli might eventually return to public service. As he prepared his villa for a potential departure, he reflected on how his own period of financial constraint had validated his theories about spending and wealth. His modest lifestyle had preserved his resources while providing time for the intellectual work that would eventually restore his reputation. His strategic investments in relationships and continued learning had maintained his relevance despite his political exile. Whether in the realm of statecraft or personal finance, the same principles applied. Fortune favored not the boldest or the most fortunate, but those who understood how to transform temporary advantages into permanent ones through the patient application of strategic wisdom. The path to lasting wealth lay not in earning more money but in spending the money one had with the same careful calculation that a master strategist applied to the deployment of military forces or political capital. In the end, Machiavelli's insights into spending and wealth creation reflected his deeper understanding of human nature and the mechanisms of success in any endeavor. Whether building a fortune, conquering territories, or establishing a lasting reputation, the principles remained constant: understand the compound nature of strategic decisions, maintain discipline during periods when benefits are not yet visible, and always consider the long-term systemic effects of present choices. The merchant who followed these principles would prosper regardless of economic conditions or competitive pressures. The prince who understood them would maintain power through changing political circumstances. The individual who mastered them would achieve a form of wealth that transcended mere financial accumulation, the wealth of capability, security, and freedom that enabled one to navigate any challenge while remaining true to one's deepest values and aspirations. As the shadows lengthened across his vineyard and the evening mist began to rise from the Arno Valley, Machiavelli understood that his exile had taught him something more valuable than all his years in the corridors of power. The secret of building lasting prosperity lay not in the pursuit of wealth itself, but in the cultivation of the wisdom to spend wealth well. This wisdom, once developed, would serve its possessor far better than any temporary fortune, providing the foundation for success that could survive any reversal of external circumstances. The compound effect of strategic spending decisions, operating silently but relentlessly over years and decades, would ultimately determine not just financial outcomes but the entire trajectory of a life well lived. In this understanding lay the true inheritance that Machiavelli would leave to future generations, not a formula for getting rich, but a philosophy for building the kind of wealth that enriches not only its possessor but all those touched by its thoughtful deployment.